Hello and welcome, and in this video we are going to be talking about or introducing adding and subtracting rational expressions, okay? Now this is actually a fairly challenging topic, one that gives a lot of people fits, so today I want to focus on one of the hardest aspects of correctly adding and subtracting rational expressions, and that's just finding the least common denominator. This is something that a lot of people tend to struggle with, and it actually stems way back in grade school with actually finding the least common denominator with just typical fractions, just like 1 over 6 plus 7 over 10. Now remember, you do need to find a common denominator when adding or subtracting fractions, but the least common denominator is actually kind of the best one, because the least common denominator is the smallest number, the smallest multiple that both denominators go into, which is going to help reduce how many times you need to simplify the fraction. Now, if you look at this, some of you might be able to quickly realize that 30 is the least common denominator between these two fractions, but how do we arrive at 30? How could we concretely know that it's 30 and not some other number like 60 or 90 or 75 or something like that? Well, believe it or not, it actually all stems down to the denominator's factors. So, if we think about 6 and 10 in their factored form, this is called the prime factorization. 6 is made up of the prime factors 2 and 3, and 10 is made up of the prime factors 2 and 5. And we write those denominators as a product of its prime factors. We can see that we have 1 over 2 times 3 and 7 over 2 times 5. Now, why do we do that? Well, the least common denominator is actually a combination of all the factors they have in common and those factors that they actually do not have in common. So if you look at both of these denominators, you might notice that each of them have a factor of 2 in common. Each of them have a 2. So it's said that they have a factor of 2 in common. Now, if we look at the ones they do not have in common, notice they do not have a 3 in common. One of the fractions has a 3, the other does not. And one of the fractions has a 5, a factor of 5, and the other does not. So those are the factors they do not have in common, a 3 and a 5, because that's only shared by one of the fractions. Well, the least common denominator is actually the product of all of these factors. So the least common denominator would be the factor they had in common of 2 times the factors they did not have in common, which were 3 and 5. And if you didn't guess it, 2 times 3 times 5 is 30, which happens to be the least common denominator. And then from there, we would do our typical thing, right? What do you have to multiply 6 by? What do you have to multiply 6 by to become 30? Well, 5. What do you have to multiply 10 by to become 30? Well, 3. Well, there's actually another reason for that. You would actually multiply both fractions by the factor or factors it was missing. Notice the first fraction's denominator had the factor of 2 and the factor of 3, but it was missing the factor of 5. So that's actually why we would multiply by 5 over 5. And if we look at the second fraction, it has the 2, it has the 5. What it's missing is the 3. So that is actually how we get least common denominators and get them to have a common denominator. Now, that's all fine and dandy, but things get a lot more complicated when we start throwing variables into the mix. So we're just going to focus on finding the least common denominator. In a future video, we're going to focus on actually adding and subtracting, and I'll break it down step by step for you there. But in this one, I just want to focus on finding the least common denominator, because once you're able to do that, the rest of the work is actually fairly straightforward. Now, notice in the previous problem, the first thing that I did was I factored each of those denominators. I factored 6 and I factored 10. So we do the exact same thing with rational expressions. We want to factor each denominator. So in the first fraction, right, that's just a difference of squares of x plus 1 and x minus 1. And the second fraction was just your typical quadratic trinomial, which factored down to x plus 2 and x plus 1. And now we can think about our least common denominator as a product of the factors they have in common and the factors they don't have in common. Now, if I look, both of these fractions have x plus 1. Notice both of these fractions have a factor of x plus 1. So the factor that it has in common is the entire factor of x plus 1. Now, what do they not have in common? Well, notice this denominator here has a factor of x minus 1, the other does not. And in this fraction here, it has a factor of x plus 2, and the other denominator does not. So those would be the factors that they do not have in common, a factor of x minus 1 and a factor of x plus 2. So the least common denominator is actually going to be all three of those factors multiplying each other. So the least common denominator would be x plus 1, x minus 1, and x plus 2. And that's it. That's all it takes to find the least common denominator of a rational expression. And then if we are actually adding or subtracting, we would multiply each one by what it's missing from its denominator, but we'll worry about that a little bit later. Let's just focus on finding that LCD. All right, so I want to take a look at just a couple more examples and make sure that we're all on the same page. So let's go ahead and take a look at our next example. Okay, let's find the least common denominator for these two fractions. So first thing we always do is we factor each of the denominators. So in each of these cases, it's just a quadratic trinomial that we should be able to factor very quickly. The first fraction is x plus 4 and x plus 3. The second fraction is x minus 5 and x plus 3. Now we should think about what factor or factors it has in common. Well, if we look, both of these fractions have a factor of x plus 3. Notice both of them have an x plus 3. So that would be the factor that they have in common, x plus 3. What do they not have in common? What does one fraction have that the other does not? Well, this fraction has an x plus 4, which the other does not, and this factor has an x minus 5, which the other does not. So those would be the factors they do not have in common. They do not share. A factor of x plus 4 and a factor of x minus 5. So what that means is that the least common denominator is going to be all three of these factors. An x plus 3, an x plus 4, and an x minus 5. And that would be your least common denominator. All right, good. I hope this is helping out. Let's cover just one more problem, and this one's going to involve a little bit of work. It's going to be a little bit trickier, so hang tight. All right, so let's take a look at this one. So we have a little bit more complicated problems to factor here. Now, I'm going to show all the steps, but I'm going to kind of briefly go through them because this should be secondhand for you by now. In the first fractions denominator, we should first take out a greatest common factor of x, and then we should notice that there is a difference of squares. So the first fractions denominator factors down to x times a quantity of x minus 3 times a quantity of x plus 3. So it has three factors. It has an x, it has an x minus 3, and it has an x plus 3. Now the second fraction is actually going to be factorable by grouping. So remember, you group the first two terms, you group the last two terms, and then you take out the greatest common factor in each. So I can take out an x squared and a negative 9. Notice common binomial factor of x minus 4, which I can factor out. And then on top of that, I have a difference of squares with x squared minus 9. So that second fraction's denominator factors to the quantity of x minus 3 times the quantity of x plus 3 times the quantity of x minus 4. So once again, three factors. So we got a lot going on in this one. So the first thing that we should do is we should think about what factors do these denominators have in common. Well, if I notice, both of them actually have x minus 3. Notice that both fractions have an x minus 3, and both fractions actually have an x plus 3. So this actually has two factors in common, x minus 3 and x plus 3. Well, that's great. What do they not have in common? What do they not share? Well, notice this fraction's denominator has a factor of x that the other one does not have. I know it has x, but that's x minus 4. That's an entire quantity. That's a binomial, okay? So this one has a factor of just x, and this one has a factor of x minus 4. And notice those are not shared. So those would be the factors they do not share. Those are the factors that are not in common. A factor of just x and a factor of x minus 4. So what that means is that the least common denominator is going to be all four of these factors. We have a factor of x, we have a factor of x minus 4. Those are the ones that were not in common. And then we have our shared factors, the ones they do have in common, the x minus 3 and the x plus 3. So this big guy right here would be our least common denominator. And that's it, okay? That's how we find the least common denominator. Make sure you understand this because it's going to make the future topics, which is actually adding and subtracting rational expressions, and then maybe some complex fractions, it's going to make those topics so much easier. Not only that, it's also going to make your life a lot easier once we start solving rational equations, because we use something called the clearing of fractions, which involves finding the least common denominator. I hope this video was helpful. If there's any questions at all, please make sure you let me know. Fractions are something that a lot of people struggle with, and I like to help people figure them out because they're really not that bad. So if there's any questions, make sure you reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you all in the next video.